Now Bustanai. Bustanai was a Rosh Galuta. Rosh Galuta was a position. It was called in other languages. It's called exilar. The Rosh Galuta had an official appointment as the head of the Jews in the realm that was Mesopotamia and sometimes many other countries around it. So he was the political chief of the Jews and representing them in a way to the government, but also he was considered as a prince. They were real Jewish princes. See, this was a real prince, because among other things, because those exilars are one long dynasty. It's cut and jumps from one person to another, but basically it's a dynasty of people that all of them are direct descendants from the last surviving king of the descendants of David. So the real princes were called, for us, they were the real royal princes. See, they were kings they were princes of the house of David, all of them. See, and they gave them a position for the Jews, and not only for the Jews, as princes. They are not simple people. They are not people that were chosen by whoever it was, but there were people they had their own what they call their own greatness that was embedded in their genealogy, in their lineage. So it was a lineage that everybody could had somehow respect for, more or less, but everybody had respect for. So Bustanai was Rosh HaGolah. Rosh HaGolah, this was the Jewish title for the head of the exile, but exile mostly on the land northern to Eretz Israel, and they were considered also among the Jews. They were political leaders, as political leaders. Now, who were they as people? They were different people. Some of them were considered a great tzaddikim, and some of them were far from it. See, some of them were important in creating things, and some of them were just sitting on what I call it great grandeur. They were grand lords, among other things. They were mostly living, and we'll come to it because that's the important time. When they lived under the government of the Persians, which was to be exact, they were the first Mesopotamia and Iran were ruled first by different dynasty and different nation of Parthians, with a TH. So the Parthians were one dynasty, then came a more Iranian Persian dynasty, the Achaemenids that were later on. And for them, we have it from some sources, they were considered in the government, in the Persian government, their position was they were the fourth rank in the government. And there was the king, the Shah, whatever it was called, and the Rosh HaGolah was number 4 in the hierarchy. So they were for the authorities, they were great princes, see? And they had the position, and they were what they call, they were friendly, or not friendly, but anyway, they were always they had to do with the kings of the realm, because they were not. Very rarely in other places we had Jews that had such a position, but they had the hereditary position of rulers of the Jewish people. Now the Jews, because they were they were the descendants of David, held them in great respect, and in the time when they are referred to, when they are mentioned usually they are mentioned always with the title Mar, Mar, which is master so and so, or Maran, or Marana. So that was the title. Some of them could and have been rabbis in that time, but basically that was the title. And the title was a master. They were the masters of the Jews, and they had also officially, from the government, they had the power to execute justice over the Jews. So the Jews in the realm were really under them. And so this was one part. Let me just add, almost as a beginning for the next. Later on, we had a kind of a double government. There were the two great yeshivot of Babylonia, Sura and Pumbedita. The heads of those yeshivot, that were called later Geonim, had also a very high position. And usually the Geonim and Rosh HaGolah, they were the rulers of the Jewry there. So in a very clear way, the relationships between them were not always the same. I mean, sometimes the Geonim were much more powerful because of personality, and sometimes the Rosh HaGolah was a much more powerful person, and the Rosh Yeshiva is an unknown person. In the list of he was a Rosh Yeshiva, but basically it was a three-part government. Two Geonim and Rosh HaGolah, they were the rulers of Judaism. I'm mentioning it among other things because this is, in most times, when we had any kind of there was a Jewish autonomy, practically, up to the time of emancipation. There was some Jewish autonomy, and Jews had a right of a certain amount of self-rule, which depended very much on the politics, on the period, on the religion of the rulers. But basically, it was there. But it was never something that was completely official. In Babylonia at that time, see, the Rosh HaGolah was officially the head of the Jews. It wasn't just a title, an empty title. It was a real title with real power. Possibly the Rosh HaGolah not only could execute justice, he or other people under him, but seemingly they had the power of dealing with the culprits by punishing them in different ways, including perhaps a capital punishment. So they were really powerful princes, and they could, and they did from time to time use it. They seemingly, from time to time, it was done later on in other places. The people that were offenders in one way or another sometimes had been ordered to cut their heads. So it's not a nice Jewish way, but they did it. See? There were people that the Rosh HaGolah ordered to cut his head or to kill him. So it's a government. Now, I'm speaking now about Bostanai, not just because he's a person that was himself a legend, but also because he lived in a most interesting time. We know more or less, we don't know exactly dates, surely not about his birth, but it's about something like 620 to about 680. That's about the period, since 7th century, which was, politically speaking, a very important point in history. This was the time when the Arabs began to conquer the Eastern world. So it was, Bostanai was the person who was really in the change of governments, from the Persian government to the Arab government, and it is a very important because of that itself. It is important to remember him, because you see, you have an upheaval. The whole world is changing. The religion of the world is changing. The rulers of the world are changing. See, instead of those traditional rulers that were in many countries, say in Palestine, in Egypt, later on, about the same time in North Africa, but also in Iraq, Syria, Iran. Those people, it would be an interesting speculation, but I'm not going into it. How could they manage? There was basically not such a great people, but how did they manage to conquer a world and create an empire that was as great as some of the greatest empires in the history of the world? So, but they were there, and everything was changed. The old laws, the old customs, even in so many ways, the old language changed. So they came in and they swept everything before them, and it became a new world. Now, Bustanai, which, first of all, the name Bustanai is not a real proper name. It's seemingly a kind of a nickname. What his real name was, some think that he was called Hanina. It seems to be unlikely because whatever we know about him he was this Bustanai ben Haninai. That was his name. Now, Bustanai means, Bustan is in Persian a garden, an orchard. So he was called Bustanai because of a story connected with the garden. But this is the name that he's known for in history, in his time and for many hundreds of years later. So this was Bustanai, the story. And now I'm saying, whether the story is, now we have very few sources, and the story is that the last king of the Persian Empire decided to destroy these rulers, the exilarchs, the Rashi Gola, to destroy all of them. And so he killed all those that he could lay hands on, which was commonplace in those times. Now we do it in different ways, but in those times it was done. And so the story is that the only one that remained of the family of David was an unborn baby. This was Bustanai, who was then just he was not born yet, and the story goes that the king of Persia had a dream that he enters into a garden and he's with an axe and cuts off the trees, one tree after the other, and then when he comes to the last tree, an old man comes and stops him. Don't cut this tree. And the story is that the king was unhappy about the dream. And he asked, in fact, a Jewish scholar, what is the meaning of the dream? And the Jewish scholar told him that what you saw is really the family of David. And the old man that you saw is the King David. And he urged you not to cut the tree, not to cut the last tree. So the little child was spared and was allowed to go. And this was Bustanai, who was the heir as Rosh Gola for the kingdom. He was in fact born into being a prince. So that is the story, and therefore this is because of the garden that the king saw. He is called the child of the garden, Bustanai. That is the story that is found in some of those sources that remained from those times. Anyway, there seems to be some need to explain such a name, which is not a name. So it's something like the garden boy, the orchard boy, say something like this. That was the name Bustanai. Incidentally, in modern times, there are here and there children called Bustanai. Not very many. Don't know why. possibly because it's uncommon, and also because the story is not well known. Now, so Bustanai was seemingly, he grew up, and after, when he was about 16, he assumed what's called as ruler, to be a ruler. Somebody before that was somebody that was the fellow who really was his guardian. But later on he became the ruler, and then he was introduced to the king. Now, one of the things is, seemingly, he had a presence. We don't know about it, but he clearly had a presence. Now, there is another story about him that we don't give evidence about it. But there's a story that he's standing before the king as a subject, and then a fly comes and stands just on his eye. And Bustanai didn't move. He stood without moving, with the fly bothering him. Nothing. He doesn't try to drive out. And then the king asked him, why doesn't he do what naturally a person should do? And he said that he learned from his forefathers that when you are in the presence of a king, you are not allowed to move any part of your body without getting permission. So he didn't move. So the king was impressed, and they gave him, and they say that this was the sign of the Rosh Hagolah. From those times on, the seal of Rosh Hagolah had an image of a fly. So that was the image that he earned. Now, the story went on. So he was there, seemingly whatever it was. He was there. We don't know much about his doings, but possibly he tried to gather his principality, his power, whatever it was. And then, within his times of ruling, then came the Arab invasion. The Arabs invaded Iran, first Iraq, which was under Iranian rule. They invaded it and conquered it, and then they invaded Iran, and at the end they conquered completely the country. Completely the country. The Sultan, or the Khalif, Khalif of those times, was the Sultan Omar. Even though, just as a correction, it is the mosque that is called mosque on the Temple Mountain, that is called after the name of Omar, is not his. Even though they tried to move it backwards to those times. Seemingly, the rebuilder of the mosque was a few hundred years later, another Omar. Even if you go in the old city, you will see the street that is near the David Citadel. It's called Umar ibn Khattab Street. That is his name, because he was clearly, again, the head of the army that conquered Eretz Israel. So he was one of the great conquerors of the world. And so he came also, he went on, and again his armies really devastated almost everything that was in there, including the Persian Empire. This was an empire. It was an empire. It was strong enough to withstand. It was always in fights with Rome or with Byzantium later. But they were never completely conquered. Sometimes they were the conquerors. And so they kept more or less the country, the land, and everything else as their realm. Which again was possibly, it included Mesopotamia, Iraq of our times, and Iran, and some of the countries beyond it, which is now Central Asia. So almost to the borders of India. Depended on the times, but it was a great kingdom. And this kingdom was conquered by the Arabs. conquered by the Arabs with the Arab rule, and this King Umar, I mean, he was the ruler, even though he wasn't officially, he was called Khalif, which means the replacement of Muhammad. That's the meaning of the title, replacement of Muhammad. But at least he was the ruler of the whole vast country and the army and everything in it. And then there was a meeting that he had with the Jews. It was the first time in which the Arabs encountered a big Jewish population. They had some Jews in Arabia. They tried to drive them out. They did as they're apt to do, and they sometimes mention it. They made all kinds of treaties and contracts with the Jews, but they really didn't keep any of them. See, when they had enough power, they drove out or killed the Jews that they could. So Arabia was, in a certain way, most of it was clean of Jews. Now in Iraq and Iran, there was a big Jewish population. We don't know the numbers, but there were surely hundreds of thousands of Jews. It wasn't easy to get rid of them. And more than that, it seems that the Jews had enough of the Persian rule. And Mussolini himself would just escape being killed by the ruler. And so they didn't trust the Persians. So when the Arabs came, the Jews collaborated. The Jews collaborated with the Arabs. And so it was important politically, important militarily that it came. Certain things like this happened in other places, possibly in Spain as well, and in North Africa as well. But basically it was the Jews collaborated, and the new Khalif, who is now the ruler of the whole country, meets Mustanai. Now this, we don't know again details of the meeting, but see, as I am saying, historically speaking, politically speaking, see, it's a new realm, it's a new government. They could destroy everything. They didn't do it too much because they were inexperienced, so they had to rely on the social and military and political structure that was before them. But still, it was something new, and they could do whatever they wanted with the position of the Jews. It was really, the Jews were an autonomy, an autonomy that wasn't always so malleable, so easy to rule. They had before that one or two big revolts of Jewish leaders, including one of the Rashi Gola. I didn't talk about them, but they in fact created a little Jewish kingdom in Persia. So they were strong enough to do so, and so the Jews were some kind of a power. And Umar decided first that he keeps the status quo. The Jews keep their autonomy under the Muslim law and other, but basically they keep their autonomy. They keep the Rosh Gola as their prince, as their leader. And now we don't know details about it. We know one thing, that is one of the facts. It seems that Mustanai, as I say, even from his first meeting with the Persian king, but at least this meeting that is a fact with the Arab overruler, it seems to be that he was an extraordinary person. See, I mean that captivated the people that met him. So not only did the Khalif granted him the rule, but did something very unusual. It seems that the last Persian king had We are not sure about it, whether it was 2 daughters that remained after him, or 2 granddaughters. Again, princesses of the royal house of Persia. And so, the Caliph Umar took one of them as a wife, which is, she could be what, I don't know how she looked like. I mean, no description about it, but I suppose she couldn't be terribly ugly. But more than that, see, it's also a political matter that the new king, takes the daughter of the old ruler. So it is a feeling, it's a continuation of the rule. It's not a break. It's not a complete revolution. Now, this was one daughter. The second daughter he gave to Bustalai. So Bustalai was given the other princess, the other Persian princess, as a wife. So we have here, incidentally, you can see the unusual feat. See, it is surely not the part of the work of the Caliph to do so, to find a wife for Bustalai. There is a story which I don't think it can be held, that Bustalai was unmarried at that time. I don't think that they cared very much, as Muslims, as people from the East, whether he's married or not married. But he gave him the other daughter, which means he becomes, in some way, he's the Caliph's brother-in-law, which is, you see, it is a very unusual situation. Unusual because see, here you have this Jewish ruler is becoming not just that he's tolerated, but he's given a very high person. It's not an official position to be the king's brother-in-law, but it's a very practical, very, very high position. So in that sense, you see, the fact that Bustalai was there, and the fact that Bustalai married this daughter, meant not only, it meant that the whole system will continue. And so it was for many hundreds of years it continued. The Rosh HaGolah under the Muslim rulers, and they changed from one house to another house, from Blood Dynasty, but still the Exilach, the Jewish ruler, was still the prince of the Jews, and say a very high official in his time. No, as I'm saying, when I speak about it in a historical view, it means not only that the old system continued, but the old system was in a way enhanced and enforced by that. It's a big change, because it means that the Jews got not just the official religious tolerance, but they got also a position in the state. This was created at those times, and as I said, the state changed many a time, but these Jewish princes remained the rulers of the Jews. With the relationship with the kings were not always even, but still they were the rulers of the Jews. So historically speaking, it is the man Bustalai is not just a person that was just standing between two periods. Bustalai was the person that really made it possible to continue the whole system, to continue the rule of the house of David, to continue the system of the Jewish autonomy. So all that is, as I say, even if we wouldn't know anything else about him, it just means that he's the person that kept which in a time of real upheaval, when anything was collapsing. So this remained stable. So the Jewish prince remained in his position. The Jewish autonomy remained in its former power, and that meant for the Jews in that area, perhaps they were basically much better off than they were under the Persian rule.